Sweden and UK, case studies of overregulation or overzealous enforcement.
Hello and welcome to our panel today, which is, as you can see by the title, Sweden and the UK, case studies of overregulation or overzealous enforcement. I'm Simon Bernholt. I'm a partner in the betting and gaming team at Wigan in London, and I'll be moderating this panel. We've got two excellent panelists. The first is Maria McDonald from Nordic Gambling. Maria is a Swedish lawyer with extensive experience as in-house counsel with international operators. Maria specialises in all legal matters relating to gambling, media and sponsorship, and also has extensive experience of working with dispute resolution, IT and data protection. We've also got Nick Nocton from Mischon in London. Nick's a partner in the corporate group there and is a regulatory and commercial specialist in the betting and gaming group. He's got apparently over 20 years experience advising companies from all parts of the gambling and gaming industries, but obviously, Nick, you must have started when you were at school. So we're here to discuss. We've got a few questions lined up. I think what we'll start with is, as it's very topical, the pandemic and the implications of the pandemic on the gambling sector. So maybe what we'll start with is if you could sort of talk to us about the restrictions that were introduced in each jurisdiction to deal with the potential increase in gambling due to COVID lockdowns, and also whether you see any or all of those restrictions remaining in place for the longer term. And Maria, let's start with Sweden.
Yeah, so from this summer, we have some restrictions in addition to what was already in place. So from before, we had mandatory deposit limits that needed to be set by players per day, week and month. And now, due to these temporary restrictions, we have a weekly deposit limit, which may be maximum of 5,000 SEK, which is approximately 500 euros. Previously, it was also voluntary for customers to set a login limit. That has now become mandatory, so all players must set limits per day, week and month. And finally, the previously allowed welcome bonus is limited to a value of 100 SEK, which is about 10 euros. And only welcome bonuses are allowed, so you're not allowed to retain customers by the use of bonuses. And these temporary restrictions were initially looking to end by the 31st of December. But yesterday, the government announced that they are now looking to extend them to at least the 30th of June, 2021. So we're looking for another, or possibly another 6 months with these restrictions in place, unfortunately.
Did you think they'll become ever-shifting temporary measures that ultimately become permanent, or do you think there is actually an appetite to remove them at some stage?
There will be they will have to be removed at some stage or replaced by a permanent ordinance. I don't think that these particular measures will be made permanent, but we have an inquiry in Sweden who's due to present the results and their evaluation of the new gambling market in December. And they are looking to suggest some more restrictions. For example, we think that they are going to suggest different categories of gambling products depending on how dangerous they are, where online casino games and slots are going to be seen as red. And there are most likely going to be more restrictions in place for them, for example, in terms of advertising. So advertising can only be done with particular moderation or during certain times on TV, etc. So even if these measures are not going to be permanent, at least I don't think so, I fear that there are other restrictions coming into play instead.
Okay, and Nick, so taking the British example now, what are the restrictions, and do you think some or all of them will ultimately remain permanent?
There are a variety of restrictions that were brought in early on in the first lockdown. I mean, the Gambling Commission required UK operators to provide monthly data rather than quarterly, or at least the majority of the major UK operators, so that it could get a more granular understanding of product use, etc. And it looked also at some external survey evidence. And on the basis of that, the Gambling Commission adjusted its customer interaction guidance and introduced a number of expectations, which are in effect requirements, to intensify, requiring people to review thresholds for customer interactions effectively downwards to reflect constraints on people's financial position as a result of the pandemic, and to conduct affordability assessments for people who are hitting those thresholds. They also required the customer interactions where any customer had a gaming session of at least an hour, and there was a very high-profile introduction of a prohibition on what's referred to as reverse withdrawals. So the functionality that allows people to change their mind before a withdrawal request has been processed. In other words, before their money is returned to them. And the Gambling Commission considered these all necessary to mitigate the risk of what it perceived as increased risk of gambling harms. And as for the question of, it required operators to stop or suspend bonus offers to people showing the indicators of harm. These were all in addition to the existing customer interaction guidance. A number of them we already know are going to become baked in, or that there's the Gambling Commission's intention that they will be baked in. The reverse withdrawal prohibition is the subject of a proposed permanent prohibition and the Gambling Commission's consultation on online slots, which closed in September. And the other changes which focus on time spent and amount spent and indicators of harm are all likely to be relevant to the consultation which was released last week on harm indicators, which is being discussed extensively in the industry, because it looks to entrench the concept of affordability. And that consultation is likely to result in some prescribed thresholds at which point operators are required to undertake some form of affordability assessment. And that will be not only by reference to amounts spent, but also by time spent. So there's a number. I mean, the majority of those things that I described are either going to stay in their existing form or in some revised form going forwards.
And taking that affordability consultation and the requirements, or the potential requirements that you've outlined there, do you think that the Gambling Commission will, or the regulator and or the government in the UK will look at that and say that affordability is the end, or do you think that there will be the imposition of deposit, stake, or other financial limits going forward?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I mean, the idea that at the moment operators are obliged to offer at least one of those as a voluntary, one of those limits as a voluntary customer measure. The majority offer more than one. The question of whether deposit limits are really that relevant in an assessment of harm, in particular in circumstances where you can no longer reverse a withdrawal, seems to me to be moot. I think customer losses is a far more relevant indicator of quote unquote affordability. Although this issue of whether somebody's gambling at any particular juncture is affordable is a difficult concept as far as I'm concerned. Do I think that they'll look beyond that? I wouldn't be at all surprised. In light of the fact that there is a Gambling Act review imminent, I think that there is not only the possibility of much discussed online stake limits, online slots limits. I think there's a possibility of the imposition of requiring the imposition of one of those limits at probably a loss limit at registration. I wouldn't advocate that. I think it's too blunt an instrument. I think customers should be encouraged to set those limits, and I think operators should be obliged to review them and take them into account on a risk-based approach. But the idea that everybody should be have fixed limits seems to me to be whilst attractive to regulators, very, very unwieldy and not conducive to a healthy regulated market.
So we'll talk about the Gambling Act review in a minute in a bit more detail. But Maria, what's the situation in Sweden in respect of deposit limits and or loss limits? Is that something that is likely to be mandated by the regulator?
Yeah, so like I said, there's an imposed deposit limit of maximum 5,000 SEK or 500 euros per week. But that's temporary, hopefully until next summer now then. Other than that, the players are obliged, or it's mandatory for players to set deposit limits per day, week and month. But they're free to choose whatever amount they wish. That amount, whatever amount they choose, the regulator then sees as critical for operators to take into account when they risk assess the customers, both from an AML perspective, but also an RG perspective. So in particular, the Gambling Authority has said that if a player sets an amount that is so high, it will never be reached because it's several millions of SEK. Then that is particularly something that indicates high risk, because it won't be possible to follow or monitor the player if he or she chooses to increase the deposit limit even further. For the online industry, there are no loss limits, but it's also mandatory for operators and voluntary, unless it's now during the temporary measures, when it's mandatory also for players, to set login limits per day, week and month. So a player needs to specify how long can I anticipate to be logged in.
And is that the limits that you're talking about? Is there a central system that combines it across operators, or is it per operator? And is there any sort of discussion of some kind of central system?
Yeah, so no, currently it's per operator, which is of course useless, because it means that players just shop around, which is against any player protection interests, because it's difficult to monitor customers if they keep moving on. But yes, the Gambling Authority very much encourages or wants the power to put in place a national system similar to a self-exclusion system, where these limits can be set across all operators, which from a player perspective would of course make more sense, as long as players are still incentivized to stay in the Swedish market and not gamble with unlicensed operators.
And Nick, obviously we have GamStop in the UK, but the concept and the complication of managing affordability, or even deposit or loss limits across multiple operators, possibly leads to the conclusion you said before, which is around stake limits being a blunter, but almost a tool that the regulator could introduce relatively simply.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope that they would look at these things holistically, but with the political climate that's in the UK, I wouldn't be surprised if they were encouraged to look at them all in sort of parallel or at the same time, and not necessarily in a mutually exclusive way. But I would agree with you, there are probably more direct ways of limiting spend and loss, or there are different ways of achieving the apparently desired aim to restrict more or less everybody unless they can positively prove that they not only want but can also afford to spend more than some prescribed and relatively low limits. Leaving aside the policy issues behind that, I think you're right. I mean, that it is possible that there could be. I mean, certainly the regulator wants there to be visibility across the customer's wallet, and it's called, or Gambling Commission's project is referred to as the single customer view, and the Betting and Gaming Council looking at that and helping the gambling regulator to understand what is achievable. But it's not by any means, as I understand it, available as yet. And even if it were, I'm not sure that customers will particularly want to the level of disclosure that might be required, or indeed would want necessarily for there to be such extensive restrictions on their play. I mean, obviously, it's desirable to create an environment where people who have problems with managing their gambling to have the tools available to them. But there is a significant possibility that these restrictions will have a very disproportionately large effect on people who don't fall into that category. It's an interesting, challenging to the policy issue.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of minutes left. On top of the issues you've already mentioned, is there anything else you see that's being almost certain to be included in the gambling review, the review of the Gambling Act that's coming up in the UK? And then Maria, obviously, if you could just talk a bit more about the consultation in Sweden as to the future sort of scope of the market.
There is certainly, I mean, leaving aside really interesting, but probably not quite so central to this, to our current audience, things like loot boxes, etc., which is clearly going to be something which is going to be discussed. I think there are some interesting issues around possible restructuring of the regulatory regime itself, with potentially a split out of the Gambling Commission's own remit and the creation potentially of a gambling ombudsman. I think a very real possibility is the imposition of a statutory duty of care on gambling operators, which would further embolden not only consumers with genuine complaints, but potentially others as well, and could be a very, very interesting and very busy body. I think those are the main ones, alongside the ones we've already discussed.
And Maria, sorry, we've just got a minute left, but can you give us a quick high-level view of what Sweden?
Yeah, but I think I already mentioned that we're looking to have a suggestion where different categories of games are introduced, where some are considered more dangerous than others. And online gambling, particularly casino and slots, will be considered as red. Sports betting likely to be less red, maybe orange, but still in the category of dangerous games. And we will see advertising restrictions, I'm fairly sure, coming up in the future. In addition to that, the inquiry going on is likely to propose a B2B licensing system, which is not in place in Sweden today. And it's difficult to anticipate when that will be coming into play, if at all. But potentially from, say, 1st of January 2023, such licenses could be issued. And up until then, it will be a legislative and implementary process.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for your time today and for the overview. Let's hope that we don't end up with overzealous enforcement or over-regulation in either of these markets.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Thanks.